Let me paint a scene for you. Your players are sneaking into the big bad's lair. Some bad rolls lead to them alerting a patrol even though they were playing pretty smart. You are running out of time in your session, and you can see that your players have battle fatigue. You just put them through a grueling combat with a nasty sewer monster as they infiltrated the base. And rolling for initiative now would mean a whole combat. You only have time for a round, so you'd end in the middle of a fight. And that means that you're gonna miss the awesome reveal that you had planned for weeks for this game that you wanted to leave them with, that the big bad is the paladin's dead sister. Boom! In this case, you have a couple of options. You can either roll initiative and give in to the frustrating unpredictability of D&D. I mean, something cool might happen. Or you can end early and set up for the reveal for next time. Or maybe there's a third way. So, a couple of weeks ago, by wild chance and odd circumstance, I ended up running a game of D&D for 12 people with no prep and no materials, and it was wild. I rolled a whole blog post about it and why it was the ultimate test of my ability as a DM, which you can find on Patreon for free right now, patreon.com/milesawaygames. Check it out. Now, the stresses of that event made me pull on all of my reserves and abilities and all of the things that I've learned from the different systems over the entirety of 2024, and in fact, the whole 20 years that I've been playing TTRPGs. But there was one key takeaway that stuck with me. There was one detail that I have the tendency to forget because I love these games so much. They're just a conversation. All TTRPGs are, at their core, just a group of people talking. Now, the dice are a fun add-on to bring chance and gambling into the room, as are all the character sheets and the mechanics, and all of that is supposed to help the fun. But what do we do when it holds us back? How do we maintain the joy of that structured storytelling without feeling choked on it? So in this video, I will present to you 4 simple tricks that I use to sub-navigate problems that arise at my D&D tables all the time by cutting out the game and by getting back to the basics. Part 1, crowdsource your prep. Prepping games is a crazy labor of love. You have so much that you're responsible for. You are responsible for all the monsters and sometimes your players' stats. You're responsible for like the story arc that they're telling. You're responsible for the rewards that you're gonna give for them. You're responsible for prepping the endless possibilities of the absolute chaos that your players can throw at you. It's a lot to ask of you to do all of that and also to come up with all the details and all the descriptions. So frankly, I don't anymore. I use my players to do that for me. Now, this can take many forms, but the simplest are what is often called leading questions. I've talked about them before on the channel, but I've started to really think of them rather than that as crowdsourcing the ideas. Basically, I present my players with a simple writing prompt that leads in the direction that I want to go. And then, together, we as a table describe the thing. My favorite use case for this is to do it for the places that the characters visit. And in that case, the prompts might look like, what about Main Street gives you the impression that tensions are high in the city between elves and dragonborn? Or, what qualities about the room immediately inform your character that the person living here is halfling-sized? Or even, what about the magic that you see lick around the corner betrays that it was cast by a powerful necromancer? See how they all lead somewhere and allow your players to fill in the gaps while coming to the desired conclusion? That's the key here. I also do this all the time to have players kind of describe the way their magic looks and feels so that they can really color their character and get the most out of that aesthetic fantasy that so many players crave. But there are thousands of ways to use this, some of which are way more impactful than just deciding how something looks. In a Vampire the Masquerade game that I ran recently, a PC had nearly drained a victim and felt really bad about it. So they went looking for this victim and they worked hard at it and they used their powers so wisely. So I decided that they were like definitely gonna find at least some of this poor person, but I wasn't really sure how I wanted this to play out. I mean, just finding them alive with like an orange slice in their mouth and a cookie in their hand, like they'd just gotten their blood drawn, felt decidedly not gothic horror enough for Vampire the Masquerade, but just killing the poor human was kind of boring. And it also felt mean to the player character and to the player. It was also the second or third game, and that kind of punishment I feel should really be saved for further into the character's arc. So I threw it back at the players themselves, and they came up with a bunch of ideas, and together we decided that the human was going to be like on the brink of death, and that the only way to bring them back was by feeding them the PC's blood, turning them into a ghoul, making everything worse, and also in this particular campaign and circumstances, committing a serious taboo. Now that was juicy and was something that we only could have come up with together as a table. Part 2, I planned it this way. Sometimes you just need things to go your way. Both as a player and very often as a DM, sometimes I just need a player's awesome idea to work. Either because it's just so cool, I just want it to happen, or because it opens up an opportunity for a very awesome storytelling moment. But have you ever noticed that whenever that happens, the players can't freaking roll? And yeah, I could just have them auto-succeed. After all, I said that this is just a conversation. It doesn't, the dice and all of it doesn't really matter, but honestly, that feels cheap to me. Right? Unless there's a structure there, it feels like we're kind of pushing the rules, and sometimes can make players go, oh, my roles don't matter, my choices don't matter. So the little trick that I have to fix this problem and keep my sense of honor intact is inspired by the frankly awesome Blades in the Dark, which is a game where you play a crew of daring scoundrels seeking your fortune in the haunted streets of industrial fantasy city. It is an awesome game. It feels like Dishonored, and that was enough to sell me on it, frankly. And the rules are actually all free in a systems reference document linked down below in the doodly-doo. But in addition to its very stellar vibes, it has some revolutionary mechanics, my favorite of which is called load. Essentially, in Blades, your equipment stash works backwards in time. What I mean by that is that you begin a heist with a load, which is a number of items that your character is weighed down with. You don't pick any of those items until you need them. So say that you're running along and you got inside, but suddenly your character discovers that there's a locked door keeping them from the power controls, which they need to shut off to be a distraction for the rest of the crew to get inside. The player can then mark one of their load full and produce a lockpick because they had the foresight as an amazing genius / criminal that they would need that item for this job. I love taking this same principle and applying it to really any D&D activity that normally requires hours of planning to help my players just relax about not having the perfect plan. Essentially, the way that I apply this is that they get an I planned it token that they can then spend to introduce a believable element that they planned, or that is incredibly lucky, or a piece of equipment, or automatically succeed on a test because they spent time practicing it, or really like whatever we agree at the table is believable and cool. I very often give them like a coin, like a quarter or something, or like a challenge coin is really, really cool. And then if they hold on to it throughout the entire heist and they don't spend it, then they get inspiration and they get to pass the token back. So in this big 12-person game that I opened this video talking about, I had this moment where at the third act, they had to like break into this fortified area and steal an airship to like escape this prison island, basically. And all of them, because of circumstances, read about it in the blog post. It is hilarious. Check out patreon.com/milesawaygames. It was a blast and it taught me so much. But all of the player characters ended up being clones of one another, and none of them had any memory. They had like just been set into existence in this new world. And one of my PCs, when they got their token, I saw their eyes light up and I was like, what is going on? And then when I came around to their turn, I was like, what do you want to do? And they said, I want to use my token. I think that my character is just drunk enough that they're having a memory, that they were like hypno-indoctrinated with the training to be able to fly airships. And I was like, oh no, you're part of the distraction crew. They're stealing the airship up there. And she was like, I know, I think I have to get up the tower. And she like booked and took off and started running and like rolled some crazy saves as the tower got blown up by circumstances and like had to jump up and clamber up. But that was like such a cool, interesting and weird little use of that I thought it just had to be mentioned. On the flip side, two of my players decided that they wanted to have spent the entire planning time prepping a circus trick that got them into the second story of a particular building that they had to go into. Perfect. Part 3, montage combat. Ever have a combat that your players started and you really don't want to finish? Like in the prompt at the beginning of this video, I very often find that my players get into trouble that they don't want to be into or that I don't need them to be into, and we need to move the story along, and they're fighting things that are just too low level for them, or that is kind of a waste, or maybe it's something that is way too hard and I want to move the situation along. And doing that through traditional tactical map-based D&D combat it takes so much time. 6 seconds of in-game action can turn into an hour and a half of play at the table. And while I do love the minutia and the detail of D&D combat, sometimes I just want a montage. Sometimes I just want an epic montage where my players are cool and they get away from the thing, or they kill the group of monsters, or whatever it might be, and they get to feel cool, use their cool character abilities and things that they have in their brain about their character, but we get to move the freaking story forward. So my trick is to turn a combat that you don't need to be stretched out into an hour and a half into a rules-light slugfest by just stealing Trophy's combat system. I've talked about Trophy on the channel before. It is a remarkable game that is like Green Knight dark fantasy, where you play a group of treasure hunters who are invading some ancient place that does not want you there. And the rules are actually all free. There's an SRD for Trophy as well, and the link is down below in the doodly-doo. Check it out. I'm giving away all the hacks today. So let me teach you how this works. In Trophy, when you attempt to defeat a monster, you can like combine all of your efforts with the other characters to try to fight this beast. When I start this, I ask who is going to participate in the fight. This might be important because this can also be useful to like quickly make a combat where one player is taking on a skill challenge and the rest of the players are dealing with a horde of baddies rushing at them. So the first step is to prompt your players to describe how they expose themselves to injury or attack as they are like trying to tear apart the enemies. They then each roll a single light die. You have to have 2 different colors of dice for this. I have these neat Trophy dice that I bought recently. So the number that they get on this die is called their weak point, and it represents kind of like the risks that they're taking when they're attacking the foe. Any martial artist will tell you that you cannot strike a blow without exposing yourself at least somewhat. Next, you or one of the party members gathers a different colored die, a dark die in Trophy, for each character that is involved in this fight, and you roll them all together. To defeat your foe, you are rolling against the monster's endurance, but I, in D&D, treat this basically as the challenge rating of the enemy, right? Because it kind of mathematically evens out. In Trophy, endurance is 2 to 12. Anything that is CR 12 or above, you should probably just like have a real fight if you're doing that, right? Like you should probably do tactical combat. The stakes are high enough. You can reduce that like threshold if the players are using relevant skills, if they're taking especially good advantage of their equipment. I like to have it if they like choose to spend a spell slot on this little thing, you can reduce that. Or if they're like using the environment, smart play, or if they know the monster's weaknesses or vulnerability, then you can reduce that number by like 1 or 2, but don't go overboard here. You can also increase that number if there's more than one beastie who's fighting your players, if they are at some kind of a disadvantage, or any other negative extenuating circumstances. Now, your players win if the total of the 2 highest dark die are equal to or higher than the endurance of the monster. At the end of this, After you've rolled the dark die, you collectively kind of go around and describe how each of you cut into this monster and what you do and how everybody takes them down in this kind of like pass around storytelling exercise of just like talking about how awesome you are. But success is definitely not guaranteed. And even success, as we all know, comes at a price. If any of the dark die are equal to any of your players' light die number, in trophy they take a ruin, which is like reducing their hit points. There's very few ruin in trophy, so very often, depending on the circumstances, I will treat this as like a monster or two manages to get a hit in, and I roll damage to that player for like one of the monster's attacks. Now, after all that is resolved, if the monster's not dead, if you haven't rolled above that number, and a player character is really on the outs, they can retreat, get into the back line and get behind everybody else, but then they have to pass their weak point light die over to another player who will now suffer if either their original weak point number or the new number comes up during a reroll of the dark die. If both the light dice are the same number, the character who receives this new die has to reroll. And this kind of like represents that if someone falls back from the line, it gets harder for everybody as everyone has to adjust to that new difficulty of shoring up their defenses. Now again, if your players don't succeed, if the two highest dark dice are less than the monster's endurance, but your players wish to continue fighting, you add one more dark die cumulatively for each additional like round that you do, and then you re-roll the dark dice until you get enough and you beat this monster down. This system is really easy to teach, speeds up combat in a surreal way, but doesn't just do that, it changes the structure under which we talk about combat. Combat becomes less about the minutia of what do I do in this moment, and it becomes about the story of how do we as a group defeat this thing, and how do we as a group risk ourselves for each other. And I think that is honestly everything that D&D 5e wants out of its combat system, but just quicker. I'm like on the verge of thinking that this is just a better way to do combat than any way that D&D does combat. No. They're just two different systems with two different series of strengths and weaknesses. But I can't wait to hear if you try this out. This one's definitely a little heady. Part 4, Pass the Problem. Okay. Let's wrap up with this simple little conversation game that I actually came up with on the fly during this 12-person game, and that I think really solved it and like fixed this issue that I was having in the moment. So tell me what you think of this after I'm done with it, because this one is fresh off the presses. So we jumped into the game and I had them kind of like to teach the people who had never played D&D, I had us jump right into combat. And if you've ever played a round of combat with more than 6 people at your table, you know that that is risky. The player characters were all 5th level. They were all of them kind of like the same class, so there wasn't a lot of diversity of what any different player could do, so not a lot of people were feeling very special about what they were doing. And the first round of combat took a literal hour, and I could see that people were still like having a good time and learning stuff and laughing. There was so much laughter in that first round, but they were getting battle fatigue. And I said that earlier in the video. What do I mean by that? I mean that the rigors of ordered initiative-based combat, where you have to be on and then suddenly off, and then you're off the whole time while you're waiting for your next turn, and you have to pay attention and know what's going on because that's why you're here and why you're playing the game, but that has something that you have to like actively do. It can be really hard for some people, and in addition, just the crunch of D&D combat can wear on your brain in a big way. So I saw that happening in people's eyes around the table. I was listening to them and figured I was like, I need to change something or this is gonna have diminishing returns. So I came up with this crazy idea. I was like, okay, we played one round. I will need you guys to go with me on the rest of this combat because that was fun. Let's do something that's a little bit more fiction first as we like move on to the next piece so that I can give you guys a satisfying story and we can get to the end. So we had an issue, like a collection of problems. There are a bunch of baddies who had rushed in and who were in this big bar with them and who they were in like a big bar brawl with. And in addition, the one single barbarian in the party had just rolled an epic critical and like thrown an enemy across the room and slammed it into one of the supports for the balcony in the bar, and the balcony was like coming down. So we had like a bunch of problems that were like collecting and coalescing, and I was like, okay, here's how this is gonna go. We're gonna start by rolling initiative, and at the beginning of your turn, you're gonna tell me how you are using your character's abilities or your own ingenuity as a player or whatever it might be to solve the problem in front of you. And we're starting with two problems, right? The bar is coming down on our heads and there are baddies everywhere. So the first person can choose one of those two to try to solve. But the second part of your turn is describing how it went well, and you can embellish it however you want, but then you have to add a complication for how it went worse and how that creates a new problem for the next player to solve. And then you pass that problem on to the next player who has to address this problem, say how they're going to solve it with their abilities or ingenuity or whatever, what went well and what went poorly and what the new problem is. So it turns into this kind of like improvised game of chaos telephone where they're like passing the baton of madness around the table, and every person has to use their brain and their heart and their character sheet to come up with some way to deal with the issue in front of them. No dice, no rolling. They succeed and fail every time. And it worked. I had people grinning and smiling and making crazy ideas. One character manifested that their cleric was actually a cleric of bacon, egg, and cheese god, and they had like cheese and sausage, like and egg shootout, and like save the building from collapsing on top of everyone and like shore up this structural pillar. One player who was playing a druid decided that they were not actually a druid in their current form. They were in fact a collection of bugs. And they got so overwhelmed dealing with the ice that another player was spraying around that they panicked and turned into their original form, which was just a swarm of bugs, and they started spilling into a grate in the ground. And like, it's not what we come to expect from D&D, but it's also totally what we come to expect from D&D. And honestly, I could see this be used in a variety of different ways. It doesn't just have to be for like solving combat. You could also pass the problem in downtime. You could also do it like a training montage or like a preparing for a siege montage, right? Like, I'm gonna go shore up the defenses, but unfortunately we're running out of stone. And so there's not enough stone, so we're having to like use different resources. What resources are we using? Are you gonna solve the stone problem? This last piece, more than anything, really highlights how these games are just conversations. Because I took what is basically telephone and I applied that to D&D. I took a like second grade conversation game that teaches us how difficult communication is. I applied that to tabletop role-playing games, and 12 people took it and ran with it and told a wild, cohesive story that was an absolute blast. That's it. That's the video, everyone. I want to know if you all have any tricks like this that you use in your games. Anything that like tears down the mechanics, but provides a new and interesting structure in which we explore the fiction together. Because this really sparked into my brain in the middle of this huge 12-person game, and it won't go away. It has changed the way that I think about tabletop role-playing games in a very serious way. And I keep having people who have read this blog post and are thinking about this, being like, oh, right, that's what the game is. So if you got this far, 1, I appreciate you. 2, don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, and please consider commenting little tips and tricks, or if you plan to use any of these things, or if you think I'm off my rocker. All of it is totally valid, and I want to hear all of it. And also, if you're enjoying this and you want to check out my blog post that all of this is kind of based on. If you want more of me and you want to help me not have to go back to my bartending job, please consider pledging at patreon.com/milesawaygames. Even $1 a month actually does make a difference, but there are some higher tiers that get you access to some fabled patron-only live streams that I'm going to be setting up soon, and to a playtesting tier that gets you access to some stuff that I'm working on. That requires some onboarding though. Be patient. All right. Thanks again for watching. Special thanks to my patrons. I appreciate y'all so much. Stay miles away from boredom, and I'll see you next time.